In this podcast, the last podcast of today, I'm going to complicate for many of you Abraham Lincoln. Uh, Before the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was quite open in his belief that, his hope, I should say, that the only future for African Americans was outside the United States. If Lincoln had had his way, he would have wished all African Americans out of the U.S. peacefully. He didn't want to do it by force, either back to Africa or into Central America, Cuba. He didn't care. And he was a colonizer, and he wasn't the only one. So this was his hope. He just did not believe that there was a place for African Americans in U.S. society. And at the time when he first became president, he actually implemented plans to colonize. These were kind of the seed. He started these pilot programs, I guess you would call, to colonize African Americans outside the boundaries of the United States. And where he first looked was an area in what's now Panama, the north part of Panama. And what he did is that he suggested the appropriations to Congress, that Congress give money for this program, to see if he could persuade at least a group of freed African Americans to move to Panama, set up a successful colony, and this would be a model of to all of all African Americans, because Lincoln believed in racial separation. He at this early in the war, he thought that had been his very consistent message throughout his political career, this belief or this hope in colonization. And let me just stop for a second. Colonization, the idea of colonization, is just as crazy as it sounds. Not only is it insane to think you're going to get 4 million people to to leave the United States, just the logistics of it. But let's talk about the morality. African Americans had built this country. It was their labor that had made this country successful and wealthy. Labor in the most horrendous conditions. And this is Lincoln at his worst, actually, not at his best. And I think we're used to seeing Lincoln at his best. Now, as he moves towards emancipation, Lincoln also moves towards the idea of racial separation. There had been a colony of African Americans that had settled in Liberia in Africa, but Lincoln, that had been a disaster, and to this day it's actually still kind of a disaster in Liberia. But what he starts to do is he gets a congressional appropriation of $100,000, which in today's money would probably be on the order of maybe $20 million. And what he does, and ultimately he receives $600,000. I'm throwing a lot of figures at you. Let me put it like this. Lincoln gets almost $1 million in 1862 money for these colonization schemes, which in today's money would be $50 million. And he very actively tries to persuade some African Americans to go to Panama. And he publicizes this. This is part of his way of trying to soothe the fears of Northern whites about Emancipation Proclamation. Many Northern whites, especially working class whites in places like Cincinnati, New York City, Philadelphia, were terrified that free slaves were going to come up into these cities and take the low-paying kind of menial jobs. And they were racist anyway. So one of the things that Lincoln does is, so he's trying to assuage the fears of some Northern whites by pushing these colonization schemes, by telling them, look, yeah, on one hand I'm going to emancipate the slaves, on the other hand I'm going to try to get all African Americans out of the country, right? That's really where he was coming from. He calls a group of African Americans to meet with him, And he says to them, you know what? You guys really, you're the leaders of the free black community. This is paraphrasing him, but it's really what he says. He said that if your race wasn't among us, there would not be a civil war, which I don't think they were too happy to hear about, right? It wasn't like they had come to the U.S. under their own power. They were captives. He said, he admitted that slavery was the greatest wrong ever inflicted upon any people, but that even if slavery was abolished, there would still be race prejudice. And he said, your race suffer very greatly by living among us, while ours suffers by your presence. Again, not really a Lincoln that we're used to hearing. He said that black people had almost no chance for equality in the United States, that white people would never grant equal equality, social, economic, political equality to African Americans. And he says, I'm not going to talk about this, but to propose it as a fact, with we have to deal. So this is just reality. I could not alter it if I could. It is better for us, therefore, to be separated. So this is what Lincoln wants. This is what he tells these African American leaders. And it's a highly publicized meeting because, again, the larger game Lincoln is playing is he's trying to set up the white public for the Emancipation Proclamation, because he's trying to reassure the white public that not only is it a military necessity, but he's trying to get African Americans outside the United States. It's kind of really crazy. So people like Frederick Douglass, who weren't at the meeting, met Lincoln later and actually liked him. But they're furious when they hear about this. He says, Douglass now, it expresses merely desire to get rid of African Americans and reminds us one of the politeness of which a man might try to bow out of his house some troublesome creditor or the witness of some old guilt. And I think, Douglass really nails Lincoln on this. It reminds one of the politeness with which a man might try to bow out of his house some troublesome creditor or witness of some old guilt. And other African Americans were extremely angry with Lincoln. But Lincoln went ahead with these colonization projects. In December of 1862, he signed a contract with a guy by the name of Bernard Knock, and the idea was to settle some African Americans in Haiti. So even after the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, Lincoln moves ahead with this pretty well-funded initiatives to create colonies of African Americans outside the United States, with the ultimate goal of making sure that all African Americans would eventually leave the United States and that there would be complete racial separation. Now, the Panama scheme comes to no good. Panama at this point was owned by Colombia, and Colombia protested. They weren't happy with the idea of a group of Americans settling in their country. I don't think it was much racial. They just didn't like the U.S. plopping down a group of Americans in Colombian territory. And also the Haitian scheme, it came to no good as well. And ultimately, Lincoln had to send a ship to bring back the folks from Panama. It was probably less than 100 families ultimately. They come back from Panama, they come back from Haiti, and actually some of the men that come back from Haiti end up fighting in the Union Army. So Lincoln's colonization plan, not surprisingly, comes to nothing. I will have to say that this is one of the most unsavory, if not the most unsavory, episode in Lincoln's presidency. The only thing that I can say here is that by the time he was assassinated, he's completely given up on the colonization schemes. He realizes that it's just not going to work. It's just crazy. Logistically, it's not going to work. I think the other thing that happens with Lincoln, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but African Americans, he opens the door for African Americans to serve in the Union Army, and ultimately almost 200,000 do, and they fight with great bravery. And I think Lincoln is really impressed by the military service of African Americans in the Civil War, freed blacks and ex-slaves. And to his credit, by the time he's assassinated, he's completely dropped the colonization scheme. That's not part of his thinking at all anymore, and he's thinking about a very kind of limited voting rights for a group of African Americans, and so he evolves on the question. He does move from kind of an abhorrent racial separation idea to an understanding that the United States is made up not just of white people, but of people of African descent as well, whose work had actually made the U.S. a very wealthy and powerful country, and whose fighting in the Civil War had played a big role in saving the Republic. So by the time he's shot, he's moved away from these colonization schemes, but it is pretty shocking to the energy and the expense and the time he spent early in his presidency and even after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation on these colonization schemes. Some of it is just continuity from the pre-war days. This is what Lincoln had always argued. Some of it's trying to ameliorate the hard feelings in the North that are scared about blacks coming into the North and taking their jobs. But it's a pretty shocking episode in Lincoln's presidency.